Okay. Hmm? Okay. Speaker. Oh. Thank you, Hassan.
Welcome, Professor.
Central tendency. Okay. Let's this one. Okay. Then let's open this one. Okay. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Do you hear my voice well?
Yes.
Yes, Professor.
Okay. Now I'm using the microphone number 2. Usually number 2 doesn't work well. Okay. So some of you attended QRM1 and learned the distribution, right? So now you know about, some of you know about central tendency, dispersion, skewness. Did you also learn kurtosis? Kurtosis is about the shape. How steep the distribution shape is. Okay, how steep or flat. Okay, so that is exactly what we discussed in terms of inequality reduction yesterday. Okay. Yeah, so coming back to this, I just want to add one point. Okay, so yesterday we talked about the number of people in terms of percentage. Okay, so here, if this area represents, sorry. Okay, here. Okay, if this area represents 7% of the total area size. Okay, total area size means the area size below the curve, above the horizontal axis. Okay, so area between the x-axis and the curve, that is the area. Okay, so compared to the total, okay, the total is 100%. Okay, so let's say if this area has 7% area size, okay, and that means 7% of the population have income in this range. Okay, that is the meaning. Okay, so now this way we were talking about the number of people or percentage of people. Okay, but this can also be used to discuss probability. Probability. Okay. How? This means, okay, if we draw someone, okay, if we pick someone from this population randomly, okay, without targeting anyone. If we just draw one person from this big population at random, then probability of that person having income in this range is 7%. So now we are talking about probability, not the number of people. Okay, it's not 7% of the population. Now I'm talking about probability. Okay, makes sense? Because out of 100% people, 7% of the people belong to this income range. Okay, so if you pick someone randomly, then probability of finding that person from this range is 7%. Okay. Is it clear? So random is the point. Okay. So if you don't try to target higher end of income or lower end of income, okay. So purely, no purposive process. Okay. If you pick it random, then that is the percentage. That is the likelihood. Okay, likelihood or probability that the person belongs to this income range. Okay? Yeah, so this way of thinking can be useful in some of the discussions later. Okay. Okay, now let's go back to yesterday's material. Oh. Which one is shared now? Is this one? Oh, you see this one. Stock flow. Okay. Yeah, so then we discussed different types of capital. Okay. And then we distinguished stock from flow. Okay. So I hope it's clear. Okay, now, yeah, based on that, we will start doing some analysis regarding poverty. So far, we have been talking about poverty as a static thing. Static thing, which doesn't fluctuate, going up and down. Okay, but in reality, poverty fluctuates. Okay, so it doesn't always increase or decrease. It can increase this year, it can decrease the next year. So that kind of fluctuation, that kind of dynamism is there. Okay, especially when you look at it at the household level or individual level. Okay, if you look at it at the country level, for example, aggregate level, then it will not go up and down so much. Okay, usually it has a trend. Okay, 2% increase, 2% increase, then 1.5% increase. Okay, so it doesn't go up and down from year to year. But when you look at the poverty at the micro level, usually it fluctuates a lot. Okay, especially when you look at the poor people. Okay, not high income people who have stable job employment. Okay, in the poverty context. Okay, so poverty is a dynamic condition. Okay, so the poverty rate, P0 or P0. Okay, so remember when you see this notation, it means poverty rate in percentage. Okay, yeah, so this P0 does not capture the dynamics. Okay. For example, over a certain period, let's say 10 years, you may not observe a change in poverty rate. For example, a poverty rate being 20% 10 years ago, and again 20% this year. What does that mean? Poverty rate is stable, okay? But it doesn't mean the same 20% people stayed below poverty for all the 10 years, okay? Some people escape from poverty, some people fall into poverty, okay? So when you only look at P0, you cannot tell that kind of dynamics, okay? Okay, so now at the micro level, we do some categorization. Okay, we consider typology, types of poverty in terms of how it changes over time. Okay, how it fluctuates. Okay, number one, transient poverty. Another name is transitory poverty. But I usually say transient. Okay, people whose income is above the poverty line on average. On average over some time, let's say 4 or 5 years. When you see the overtime average, that level is above poverty line. Okay. So these kind of people are not considered as being below poverty line. Okay. So they're not included in this P0. Okay, but they are still in some kind of poverty, transient poverty. Why? Because sometimes they fall below the poverty line. They are not always above. Okay? So there is some vulnerability to poverty for these people. Okay? So that kind of poverty we say transient poverty. Number two, chronic poverty. Chronic poverty means their average income over time is below the poverty line. But sometimes they go above. Sometimes they go above poverty line. Okay? So that kind of people, we say they are in chronic poverty. Okay? In chronic poverty, or they are chronic poor. Okay? We sometimes say they are chronic poor. Okay, the last one. This is the severest one. Persistent poverty, or persistent poor. People whose income is always below the poverty line. Okay, so their income status doesn't cross poverty line, either from above or from below. Okay, so the vulnerability to poverty is very high. Okay, so of course, their average income level over time is below the poverty line. Okay. So now let's do some visualization. Okay. Why not? Or why 0? Okay. For this person, income goes up and down, but always stays above poverty line. Okay. So they are not in poverty in any form. Okay. Non-poverty, or they are non-poor. Okay. And then, yes. So let's explain this notation. Okay, so 0 is just an indicator of this person. Okay. Why? This represents income. Or some output in general, like some production. Okay. But in this case, income. Okay. So Y is for income. This 0, 1, 2, 3, just the index to represent different people. Okay. What is this? What is this bar?
Mean. Mean.
Yes,
Average.
Yes. Yeah. So this bar means mean, average. Okay. But more specifically, sample mean. Okay. It's not a population mean. Yeah. But yeah, that's something you don't need to worry about. Okay. So Y bar means average of Y over time. Okay. So it's not the average across people. Average of this person over time. That is the meaning of this Y bar. Okay. And this Y bar is represented by the dotted line. Okay. Yeah. So this one. This is the overtime average of this person. Okay, which is above PL, poverty line. Okay, PL is poverty line. Okay, Y1, person 1. Okay, person 1. Yeah, his or her income is represented by Y sub 1. Okay, now this person average is above poverty line. Okay, but sometimes, once in a while, this person's income goes below the poverty line. Okay, so sometimes this person is in poverty, depending on the timing. Okay, so what kind of poverty? Transient poverty. Okay, now person number 2. This person, the average is below the poverty line, but sometimes the income goes above the poverty line. So sometimes this person is not in poverty.
It is also transient.
Yes? Are you okay? Okay, so this type of poverty is what?
It is also transient.
Sorry?
It is also transient poverty.
I didn't catch you well. Okay, so yeah, by definition in the previous slide, this person 2 is in chronic poverty. Okay. So average is below. But sometimes he or she goes above the poverty line. Okay, what about person number 3? This person always stays below the poverty line. Okay, so this person is in persistent poverty. Okay. Okay. Now, yes. So person 0 is in non-poverty. Person 1, transient poverty. Person 2, chronic poverty. Person 3, persistent poverty. Okay. And this Y bar is just the mean over time. Okay. Yeah. So this shows the it will power off soon. This one? Turn on again? Oh. Last time? You solved it? Wait. I don't remember how to. No, it's okay. Okay. I don't understand this behavior, but everybody was talking about this problem. Okay. Okay, so this just tells you it's a calculation of a mean. Okay. So this summation means it's a sum of all the income levels divided by the number of periods observed. So in this case, maybe 1, 2. Yeah, so maybe observation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 6 years. Okay. So adding these 6 numbers divided by 6. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so nothing fancy. Okay. So average income for person I over K years. Person I. Okay. T indicates the timing. So it can be timing 1, timing 2, timing 3, all the way up to timing K. So if there are K years, if the number of years is K, then this time indicator T changes from 1 to K. Okay. Yeah, for example, this particular value. Okay, this particular value is a person number 2's income level in 2, 3, 4, the 4th year. Okay. So that is represented by Y2, 4. Okay, so I is 2, T is 4. Y2, 4. Y2, 4 is this number. Okay? Yeah, so just to understand the notation. Because it may help you understand the other discussions. Okay, so in terms of poverty calculation, calculation of poverty rate, okay, P0. Only chronic poverty and persistent poverty are counted. Okay, because poverty rate calculation is based on overtime average. Okay. Yeah, so that's how they evaluate poverty. Because if you only consider one shot in time, it can be affected by some accidental things, some negative shocks in that particular time. Okay. Okay, then. So now this one, shock. What is a shock? There are positive shocks and negative shocks. But most often we talk about negative shocks when we just say shock. Okay. So shock is, it's a negative change, okay, in some output, in this case, income. Negative change that happens temporarily, okay, that drives income below its own average level, okay? So that is the shock. For example, for this person number 0, so this, the second year, this person experienced a shock. Okay, so particularly low level of income compared to his or her own average. For this person number 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe in the 4th year, this person experienced a shock, some kind of shock. Maybe if he's a farmer, then he experienced a drought. But if he's a trader, maybe he's experienced a price shock. Okay. Or if he's a laborer, maybe he experienced some injury. Okay. So there are different types of shock. But the point is, some kind of negative shock can drive the income below the usual level. Okay, and temporarily. So that is the concept of shock. Okay, but that is very important because shock can lead to chronic poverty if it's severe. Okay, if the shock is severe, the person may not be able to go back up. Okay, yeah, we'll talk about this soon. Okay, so in terms of poverty classification, different types of poverty, from the dynamics perspective. Yeah, just one example. There was research in China from 1985 to 90. So over time, these 5 or 6 years, there was research to measure the income levels, okay, of villagers. Okay, so based on that dynamic survey, they calculated the percentage of people who belong to each type of poverty. Okay, and this was the result. Non-poverty, non-poor people accounted for 41%. Yeah, in these in these 4 provinces. Okay. Altogether. Okay, 36% of people were in transient poverty. Okay, and then 18% people were in chronic poverty. And 5% were in persistent poverty. Okay. What does it represent? What does it mean? Yeah, first of all, what is the poverty rate? Based on this research, based on this survey. The poverty rate is sum of chronic poverty and persistent poverty. So 23%. 23% is the poverty rate. Okay. But you can see that out of this 23%, actually only 5 percentage points had the income always below the poverty line. So other people, somehow they escaped at least once, okay, in all these 5 or 6 years. Okay, that is the important observation. Okay. Yeah, so very often we observe a large portion of transient poverty. Okay, transient poverty, 36%. Okay, so they're not part of the poverty rate, but still they experience poverty once in a while. Okay. So this bullet number 2, what this means is very often transient poverty rate, 36%, this can be greater than the poverty rate per se. In this case, poverty rate is 23%, right? So sum of chronic poverty and persistent poverty. So this sum, compared to this sum, transient poverty rate can often be higher. Okay. In general, okay, this is not about this particular case of China, okay, in general. Okay. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, proportion of persistent poor, that is not so big. Okay. So in this case, 5%. Okay. So people somehow escape from poverty once in a while. Most people. Let's say 95% of people. Because only 5% of people always stay below the poverty line. Okay. Okay. And then also, the last line. What does it mean? Majority of people have crossed the poverty line in some way. These two groups in the middle, transient poor and the chronic poor. These people, they cross the poverty line either way over this period. Okay, either from below or from above. Okay, so 54%, more than half of people, they cross the line. Their poverty status, the annual poverty status changed. Okay, at least once. Okay, so you can see how dynamic poverty is from this example. Any question about this? Calculation or definition? Yes? Wait.
Poverty trap. It mean number 2 and 3, right?
No, poverty trap, I'll discuss it soon. Definition of poverty trap. Now I'm still just doing typology. Okay. Okay, so next week, please follow this. Bring your computer.
From your charge on this page, is it possible to maybe in some way assume that this group is like the high soul people, the middle income people, the poor people, or something? Is it possible or not?
These are all poor people. Because high income people never crosses the poverty line.
And maybe the high income people maybe
It's
on
included in zero group.
in Y0, right?
Even middle income people. So everybody else, people who are not in poverty context, everybody will be in this group.
And can we assume that the Y1 people is a middle income group? Can we assume like that?
Middle income. No, middle income people, they usually don't cross poverty line. Hmm.
Oh.
Yeah.
So it can be somehow assumed that the middle income people may be in the Y2 or Y3.
Middle income people, they belong here, group 0. Group 0. Group 1, group 2, group 3, these are all poor people.
โอเคค่ะ
They are not high income, they are not middle income.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Is it possible that the majority will be the non-poverty, like in the some country that have many
Sure.
of rich
If you
people?
go to a high income country, you may not find any poor people. Yeah, that is very, very possible. Okay, so next week, please bring Microsoft Excel with whatever device, laptop or what, any device. Okay. Yeah, the assignment 1 will be explained hands-on, but also assignment 2. Okay, assignment 2 will also be explained, but assignment 2 is not about Excel. Okay. But for this assignment, number 1, better you practice first. Okay, using your finger. Yeah, otherwise, if you only listen to explanation, then when you do it at home, then you may not have good idea. Okay. Okay, now new concept related to poverty. Dynamics, okay? Related to poverty dynamics. Vulnerability to poverty. Okay. What is the definition of vulnerability to poverty? Okay. Now we talked about this poverty as expressed by this notation. Okay. So Y sub IT. Y IT. Income of person I at time P. Okay. And then we said if this value is below poverty line, PL. Okay. And then this person is in poverty, okay, below poverty line. And this is an exposed outcome. What is exposed outcome? It already happened. Okay, it already happened in the past or current. It's not the future. Okay, so something that happened, you observed or you measured. Okay, you elicited. Okay, you collected the information and then decided, okay, the value is below poverty line. Okay, so that is an exposed outcome. Okay, so it can tell you who is currently poor. Okay, yeah, so by collecting this YIT from many people, you calculate this P naught. Okay, P naught at one point in time, at T. Okay. But sometimes we are interested in who the future poor will be, especially immediate future. Okay, so we may be interested in understanding this one. Okay, the difference is the time is T plus 1. Okay, T means it's this year or this period. Okay? So the current time is represented by T. Okay? T plus 1 means it's future. So if the time period is year, then it means next year. Yeah, but if you want to use different time periods, you can also define that. You can also define it daily, monthly, or by decade. Okay? But the point is in the next period, in the next observation. Okay? So sometimes you are interested in knowing this one. In the next period, who will be below poverty line? Okay, the definition of vulnerability to poverty is a person I is vulnerable to poverty if the person has a high probability of being poor in the next period. Okay? High probability. So this is about probability. Okay? So vulnerability to poverty, it can be 70%. What does it mean? That person is 70% likely to be below poverty line next year. Okay, so we are talking about probability. How likely is it? How probable is it? Okay, so that is the concept, or let's say definition of vulnerability to poverty. Okay, but what kind of indicator? Okay, so now we talk about the indicator of vulnerability. Okay, vulnerability to poverty. So it's still, we are talking about probability. Okay, by definition, vulnerability to poverty is a probability. Okay, so now we use this notation. VIT. Because it's vulnerability, we use V. Okay, I is for person I. T means, okay, we are measuring it or we are talking about it at present. Okay. So VIT means probability of person I being in poverty at T plus 1. Okay. So we are talking about it now. Okay. Now means T. Okay. But this is about probability of being in poor next year. Okay. So that is why we can express it this way. So VIT is probability, okay, PR stands for probability. Okay. Probability of this number, this number means income. Okay. Income Y of person I at period T plus 1 next year. This income being below poverty line. Okay, it's just a notation. Okay, the same meaning as I explained qualitatively. Okay, so that is the indicator of vulnerability to poverty. Okay, so we are talking about the next year. Okay, but we are talking about it this year. Okay, so this year we are talking about the future, near future. Okay. So that is why when we write B, it's not T plus 1. It's T. Seeing from this year, probability of this person being in poverty next year is this probability. Okay? How do we measure it in practice? How do we measure it? There are two methods. One is exposed calculation. The other is ex ante calculation. Yeah, as I mentioned, exposed means we are talking about what already happened. Okay? You use the information that's already been confirmed. Okay? Ex ante means you make kind of prediction about what has not yet happened. Okay? But purpose is the same. Okay? Either exposed calculation, ex ante calculation. The purpose is to know about next year. Okay? So we are still talking about this probability regarding next year. But the difference is using the past data or not using the past data. Okay? Okay, so let's just explain exposed calculation first. Then we take a break. Okay? Exposed calculation of vulnerability to poverty. It's simple. You just use income data from the past several years. Okay? For the same person. For the same person, I. Okay? So that means this person's income in year T minus 1, last year. And then T minus 2, 2 years ago. T minus 3, 3 years ago. Okay? So you just consider this person's already confirmed income in the near past. Okay? And then how often this person was in poverty? How often? 1 out of 5 times, then 20%. If twice out of 5 times, then 40%. Okay, so that's how you calculate this vulnerability to poverty. For example, if you find that this person was in poverty in 1 out of 5 years, okay, in the past 5 years, then vulnerability to poverty is 20%. Okay, so you're looking at the past. You're using the past data to infer the likelihood of being in poverty next year. So that is the exposed method, exposed calculation of vulnerability to poverty, which is about near future. Okay? Okay, then let's take a break for 10 minutes. Is the voice clear?
Yes.
Yes, Professor.
Okay. Some people are both offline and online. Okay. Yeah. Okay, vulnerability to poverty. Okay, how do we calculate it? Two methods. Okay, one is exposed method. Relatively simple. Just looking at the previous years, what the income was, and how often the income was below poverty line. If that was 1 out of 5 times, then 20%. And that number we just use and say this person is 20% likely to be in poverty next year. Okay, that is the exposed method.
Yes,
The
sir.
other, yes.
I am a little confused. I had a question.
Who is this?
Dilasha.
Vilasha. Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
This when you calculate like this ex post calculation, like you take it the income of the same people for, like, let's say for past 5 years, right? So like, but during those past 5 years there will be new group of people who will start working like in the mid, right? How do you incorporate them, like who might be working who might have income below the poverty line, but there will be those people also, right? So like, how do you?
This is about individual people.
Okay.
It's not the percentage of people. We are talking about each and every person. So when we look at the data, then we look at the previous income for each and every person.
Okay.
And then for each and every person, we define this number, percentage. Okay. For some people, maybe the number is 20%. Some people maybe 40%.
Okay.
Okay. So it can vary from person to person.
Okay.
Okay. What about the ex ante method? Ex ante method of calculation. Ex ante method. This also uses confirmed data. Okay. But the way we use it is a bit different. We don't only look at the poverty, which is Y. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Y is poverty, right? In exposed method, we only look at Y. But in the ex ante method, we also look at some factors, X. Okay, so both factor X and income Y. Okay, so let's think about previous year, current year, and next year. And then you have information on income Y, and also some factor X1, X2. Okay, now you are in year T. Year T is the present. That's the current. Okay, so you only have access to data up to T. Okay, so now in terms of, yeah, we abbreviate the person's indicator. Okay, we are only talking about one person. Okay. So this year's income is YT, previous year income is YT minus 1. Okay? And then this factor. You don't know the factor, but probably this is land size. Okay? Another one may be labor input. Okay? Okay, and you do some analysis. Analysis, what kind of analysis? Analysis to look at how factors in the previous year affect this year's income. Okay, so that kind of analysis you do. So relation between this and this. Okay, we are in year T. So we already have data for T and T minus 1. Okay, so using that, we try to establish the relation between this year's income and the previous year's factors. Okay. Yeah, we obtain some coefficient for each factor. Coefficient B or beta. You don't have to worry about it. Okay. Now, using that relationship, using that coefficient, we do prediction about next year's income. Okay, what kind of prediction? Oh, what happened? How do we? Sorry. Blank page? Blank page, yeah, I don't have now. Okay. But maybe this will help you see better. Okay. So establishing the relation between previous year's factors and this year's income. So that's the first step. Okay. And then in the next step, okay, good. In the next step, what you will do is, using that relation, okay, we try to estimate next year's income. Okay, y t plus 1. Okay, because we established the relation between factors, previous factors, and the current income. Then using the current factor, okay, using the current factor and that established coefficient. So this coefficient, you just use it. Same coefficient you use to predict next year's income. Okay, so this is what we call ex ante method. We are using available information, the best available information, to predict next year's outcome. Okay, so that is what's written here. Okay, now we try to classify. Classify vulnerability. Classify means high, medium, low, that kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, so this classifying means converting quantitative information to qualitative information for easy understanding. Okay, so one method of classification is this. A person is vulnerable to poverty if at T, okay, now, if at T, the probability of being poor in the next period is higher than some threshold. So we define a threshold, alpha. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so simply, if the vulnerability is higher than alpha, higher than the threshold, we say this person is vulnerable to poverty. If below, we don't say this person is vulnerable. Or we say this person is not vulnerable. Okay, so just apply a threshold. And then classify whether that value is, the probability V is above or below. Okay, since V is probability, alpha is also a probability. Okay, so we can say the threshold alpha to be 40%, 30%. So that kind of thing you would do. Example, if this threshold is 50%, then we say the person is vulnerable if V, okay, vulnerability is above 50, above 50%. And we say not vulnerable if the vulnerability to poverty is below 50%. Because we set the threshold at 50%. Okay? And that is one example of this formal classification. Another example, a little bit more complicated. Instead of one threshold, we apply two thresholds. Okay? Applying two thresholds means dividing into three groups, three levels. Okay? Okay, two thresholds. What thresholds? One is the same as before, 50%. That is one of the thresholds. We consider another threshold, P0, poverty rate. Okay, so if the poverty rate of this community is 20%, then we consider 20 in addition to 50. Okay, so we consider two thresholds, one 50%, the other one 20%. Okay, so that method is also often adopted. Okay, so at 50% and at 20%, there are thresholds. Since there are two thresholds, people are divided into three groups. Okay. Yeah, so for each group, yeah, we use some expression like highly vulnerable. Highly vulnerable if the vulnerability is above 50%. Okay. And then moderately vulnerable if the vulnerability is between 50 and the poverty rate, like 20%. Okay. And then not vulnerable if the vulnerability is lower than P0. For example, 20%. Because there are three groups, we differentiate some expressions. It's not just vulnerable or not. We have three different ways of kind of levels of expressions. Highly vulnerable, moderately vulnerable, not vulnerable. Okay? But you as a researcher, you can define the expression. Okay? As long as you clearly state it. Okay? In the methodology section. Yeah. So instead of highly, you may say very vulnerable. Okay? That is also fine. Moderately vulnerable, you can change it to somewhat vulnerable, for example. Okay? So you as a researcher, you can define, but you have to define it clearly so that readers will understand your research results. Okay? Okay, so that is the formal classification of vulnerability. So using sometimes one threshold, sometimes two thresholds, or more. So if the main purpose of your research is vulnerability, assessing vulnerability, maybe you will consider more levels. Okay, so depending on the purpose. If this is just to give you basic information of your sample people, then maybe you don't need to divide it to too many levels. Okay.
Can you repeat how the threshold is set again?
Which one?
Like how the threshold alpha is set again, like set. What is arbitrarily? How is it set? The
How to
threshold.
say, this alpha is arbitrary. Okay, so there is no method. Okay, there is no criterion. Okay, so you just set it. But you need to clearly write it, state it in your document. Okay, you say you will define this way. If vulnerability is above 50%, then you say that person is vulnerable to poverty. Okay, so it's a matter of how you define. But the second one, okay, this is often adopted. So one threshold can be arbitrary, like 50%. But the other threshold, you use the poverty rate. Okay, so in this case, it's not arbitrary. This comes from the actual poverty statistics. Okay. The middle group, when the vulnerability to poverty is below 50%, but above the poverty rate. For example, 20%. Okay, so we call people in that group moderately vulnerable to poverty. Okay, this means they are more likely to be in poverty than a randomly drawn person. Does it make sense? Because their vulnerability is higher than poverty rate. Let's say 30%. If the vulnerability is 30%, then that person is likely to be in poverty, more likely to be in poverty than a randomly drawn person. Do you understand this? If poverty rate is 20%, let's say P naught is 20%. That means if you randomly draw one person, then the probability of this person being below poverty line is 20%. Okay? Because 20% of the population are below the poverty line. Okay, so that's the alternative meaning of poverty rate. It's not just counting people. It can also tell you the probability. Okay. Yeah. So if you
the vulnerability and the poverty related difference may be high or maybe within a range.
What's your question?
The difference between the vulnerability Suppose it is 50% and 20%. Is this actually possible? The
Well,
difference.
vulnerability. Yeah, so it's not after observing the poverty status next year. Okay, so we are estimating what will happen next year using either ex post method or ex ante method. But these are all about talking about next year. Okay, so it's before observing the actual income outcome. Okay, so this gives you some justification to refer to this range of people as moderately vulnerable, because they are more likely to be in poverty than a random pick person. Okay. Okay, so this one was what we just discussed. This is formal classification of vulnerability. There is also informal classification. Informal classification. How do we classify highly vulnerable, not so vulnerable, that kind of thing? Okay, a person is vulnerable to poverty if this year's income, okay? Oh, right. Yeah. If YIT, okay, person I's income this year is not much higher than poverty line. It's higher than poverty line. Okay, so this year, this person is not in poverty, but not so much higher than the poverty line. Then you say this person is vulnerable to poverty. Make sense? Okay, so this year not in poverty, but because the poverty income level is not so much higher than poverty line, this person, you say, is likely to be in poverty next year. Okay, there is a not so low likelihood or probability of falling below poverty line next year. Okay. So this is like setting a vulnerability line somewhere above poverty line. How? Let's say this is one example. The World Bank reported poverty and vulnerability in Latin America by using poverty line of $4 per day and a vulnerability line. Vulnerability line of $10 per day. Okay, remember PPP? I don't explain PPP today. Okay, so we consider two lines. One is poverty line. The other one is vulnerability that comes above poverty line, but not so much above. So in this example, $10. Okay. Yeah, and then the vulnerable population is people with daily income between these two lines. Okay, so above poverty line, but below the vulnerability line. Okay, it's an informal classification. Okay, example, in 1995, poverty rate was 45%. And the vulnerability rate was 30%. Vulnerability rate means percentage of people who are between the two lines. Okay, so below the poverty line, 45% of people were there. Between the two lines, above poverty line, below vulnerability line, 30% of people were there. Okay, and that was 1995. In 2010, how did it change? Poverty rate became 30%, reduced. But the vulnerability rate was 35%. It increased. Okay. But total people, including poor people, okay? Total people below the vulnerability line, that decreased. Okay? Because the total people is this plus this. Okay? So 45% poor people, 30% vulnerable people. Together, 75% was below the vulnerability line. Okay? But in the later year, 30% plus 35. So together, 65% people were below the vulnerability line. Okay? So when you look at the number of people below the vulnerability line, it decreased. And also, when you look at the number of people below poverty line, it reduced from 45 to 30. Okay? So basically, the situation is improving. But when you only look at the people between the two lines, it increased a bit. Okay. Yeah, so using or introducing this vulnerability line, you can get some insight about people who are not in poverty, but are likely to be, likely to fall below the poverty line next year. Yeah, so this kind of tells you the emergence of a lower middle income class or a lower middle class who escaped from poverty but remains vulnerable. Remains vulnerable to shocks. When there are negative shocks, then these vulnerable people are likely to fall below poverty line. Okay, yeah, so that is the typical problem experienced by middle income countries. Okay, so places that was successful in reducing poverty, okay, lowering poverty rate, but still having this problem of vulnerability. So people who are in transient poor, okay, transient poor, that are not captured by poverty rate. Okay, so nowadays, compared to the MGD period, okay, in SDG period, addressing vulnerability to poverty is becoming more and more important, okay, as a component of anti-poverty strategies, okay. Okay, any question about these definitions? Yeah, you can ask questions later. Okay. Okay, so we've been talking about negative shocks. Okay, because these vulnerable people, they will actually become poor when there is a negative shock. Okay. So now we begin to understand a bit about those types of shocks. Okay. Yeah, there are some types of negative shocks. Yeah, so as I said, again, the definition of shocks. Shocks that affect a person's income level. Yeah. Yeah, to go below the poverty line. Okay. And that can be classified into some types. Okay, so now we discuss 4 types. One is shocks to asset, or we can say shocks to capital. Capital, as we discussed yesterday. Okay. Okay. So shocks can be applied to asset holding or capital holding that is used to generate income. Okay, including human capital, including social capital. Okay, or public capital. Yeah. For example, illness or accident affecting capacity to work. This is a shock to which capital? It's a shock to human capital. Okay. Loss of livestock. Yeah, that is it's a shock to, it's kind of physical capital, but sometimes we say natural capital because livestock is a living being. Okay, or land expropriation, losing land. Someone takes away your land. Okay, so that is also your capital being lost. Loss in value of financial assets. Okay, financial assets basically in the monetary form. So somehow you lost some money. Maybe there was a theft. Maybe you spent it. Okay. So that is shock to asset. Another type of shock, shock to the context in which asset is used to generate income. Shocks to context. For example, harsh weather, climate shock, drought, flood. Okay. Yeah. Or a fall in producer prices. Okay. So price itself is not your capital. Okay. Weather or input used for farming, that is not your capital. Okay. But those things can be affected. Okay. So that is not shocks to assets or shocks to capital, but shocks to the context. Okay, or a rise in input prices. Market shocks. Unemployment rate. Okay, it can increase, or civil war, kind of external factors. So it's not your capital that is being lost, but because of the context, okay, you experience a drop in your income level. The next one, shocks to the context in which income is transformed into consumption. Remember we talked about income and expenses, which is a better indicator of living standards. Ideally, we want to use expenses, okay? Because it's how much you spend that directly affects the level of living standard, okay? Yeah, but that process, okay, transformation of income, okay, from income to consumption or expenses, that process may be affected by shock. For example, rising food prices. Yeah, so food prices in the markets getting higher and higher. Okay, so with the same income, you can consume less amounts of food. Okay. Market disintegration. Yeah, so you lose access to good markets. Okay. So yeah, you may end up spending too much, or you may not be able to find the appropriate input. Okay. So that is also a shocks to context in which income is transformed into consumption. Okay, shocks to transfers. Transfer of some money. For example, loss of access to safety net. Okay, safety net is basically some kind of aid or subsidy coming from authorities. Okay, so sometimes you lost access to services. Okay, or economic crisis at the destination of migration, affecting remittance. So if people are dependent on remittance coming from other countries, from overseas, maybe through relatives or something. But in the destination country, there was economic crisis. Okay, so that can affect the remittance. So that is shocks to transfers. Okay, so transfer of money, financial resources being affected. Okay, yeah, so it's good to understand different types of shocks. Okay. Another important categorization of shocks. The shocks can be idiosyncratic or covariate. Yeah. Now we have the technical terminology, but the meaning is not so difficult. Yeah, so yeah, let me explain. Yeah, it's important to distinguish idiosyncratic and the covariate shocks. Okay, idiosyncratic shocks is a person-specific shock. Okay, idiosyncratic shocks affect only some people, or sometimes only one person. Okay, so individual type of shocks. Okay, or household-specific shocks. That is idiosyncratic shocks. Covariate shocks affect a large scale of people at the same time. For example, drought. Okay, drought can affect many people, many farmers in the same area. Okay, but illness is an example of an idiosyncratic shock. Okay. Yeah, unless it's a kind of pandemic. Okay, everybody's suffering with the same sickness. Okay, in a normal context, when people falling sick for a while, that kind of thing, that is idiosyncratic shock or injury. Okay. So why is it important to distinguish these two? Yeah, because countermeasures can be different. Okay, policies or some actions can be different. Most importantly, idiosyncratic shocks can be insured locally within the community. For example, mutual insurance. Okay, so in many rural communities, in poor communities, very often you notice people have some kind of a mutual health mechanism. Okay, they pool some money, they contribute to the pool. Okay, and then people in need, people in trouble can use it. Or sometimes people can borrow some money with some good reason, justification. Okay, so that kind of mutual help, mutual support mechanism can ensure this type of shocks, idiosyncratic shocks. Okay, but covariate shocks cannot be ensured this type of in this type of mechanism. Okay, so only idiosyncratic shocks can be ensured locally. Yes. Wait. Mhm. Mm.
How about correlation? Is that about macro
Combination?
level in public policy?
Mhm.
For example, we think
Mm.
about
Mm.
the compensation
Mm.
after the farmer they got
Mm.
some consequence of natural disaster.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So that kind of insurance is also available, like an index-based insurance.
In public policy.
Public policy. Yeah. So when there's a drought or some disaster affecting a wide scale of community or people, yeah, that can also be insured, okay, by participating in some insurance scheme. Yeah, that is particularly designed for climate shocks, for example. Yeah, so index-based insurance means, yeah, so authorities or some investigators come, okay, and then they observe your field, okay, they take pictures, and then assess, determine, yeah, how much of the field was affected for how long. Sometimes they use drone, sometimes they use remote sensing, okay, in a more sophisticated community or country. Yeah, so that kind of insurance is also available, but not everywhere. Okay, yeah, it is often unavailable in poor places. Okay, so maybe we just finish this slide and then then finish. Okay, now shocks. When we say shock, basically we are talking about short-run shocks. Okay, so some shock that doesn't last for many years. For example, drought. It doesn't happen for 10 years in a row. Okay, it only happens once in a while. That's why we call it shock. Okay, but short-run shocks, it can have a long-term effect, long-term consequences. Okay, once you suffer, once you experience, even if it's short-run, even if it's just one season or 1 year. Okay, it can affect the livelihood likelihood, okay, probability of falling into poverty. Okay. So some examples. Studies using panel data. What is panel data, by the way? Panel data is the most powerful type of data to generate evidence. Panel data means you collect data, for example, household data. You collect the same type of or similar type of information, variables, repeatedly from the same households or from the same interviewees, from the same respondents. Okay, doesn't need to be household. From the same respondents, you collect the same type of information more than once, regularly. For example, once in 3 years. Okay, so that kind of data, we call it panel data, which is a very ideal type of data, but also difficult to obtain. Yeah, for example, when you think about student research, thesis or dissertation, maybe more than 99% of students, they do not collect panel data. They may use panel data collected by someone, okay, like some market information, that kind of thing. But when we talk about primary data, most students, they do not use panel data because they don't do a survey in 2 consecutive years or 3 consecutive years. Okay, they collect data once, basically. Okay, Just some examples, case studies. In rural Pakistan, exposure of preschool kids to nutritional shocks. Okay, maybe there was some drought, some pest outbreak, so they suffered from shortage of food. Okay, so this kind of short-run negative shock, okay, was found to have long-term consequences on their school enrollment. So long-term consequences means the shock didn't materialize in the negative output only for 1 or 2 years, not only for 1 or 2 years, but consecutively for 5 years or even 10 years. Another example from Indonesia. Better rainfall in women's birth years affected their adult achievements in many dimensions of well-being. For example, 20% higher rainfall led to being 0.6 centimeter taller, completing 0.22 more schooling grades, more schooling years, compared to those who received only normal rainfall. Okay? So we are comparing those who received higher rainfall, 20% higher rainfall, versus those who received normal rainfall in their birth years. Okay? In their birth years. That means there was more food when those women were born as a small baby. Okay, so they had better nutrition. Okay, so that nutritional difference affected. It had a long-term consequence, long-term difference. So height was taller, schooling was longer, achievements were longer, living in better quality of houses. Okay, so that kind of evidence was generated using panel data. Okay, so it's not a one-shot cross-section research. Okay, so it took very long time, years, to collect the data and do the analysis to derive this conclusion. Okay, so now we stop here. Any question? So next week you bring Excel. Okay, to analyze dynamics in poverty. Okay, only one. Okay, anyway. Okay. See you next Wednesday.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you.